The salt spray stung my face, a familiar bite against skin already weathered by too much time staring at screens, too much time lost in the sterile hum of the observatory. The ferry groaned, a metallic sigh against the choppy grey waves, its engines a dull throb beneath my feet. This was the edge of the world, or close enough. An island community, ferry only runs once a week. It was precisely the kind of isolation I'd sought. To disappear, to let the universe spin on without me for a while. My wife, Elena, would have loved this. She'd always spoken of wild coasts, of wind-battered cliffs and the raw power of the sea. She saw beauty in the untamed, a stark contrast to my own methodical pursuit of order in the celestial chaos. Now, only the chaos remained, a void where her laughter used to echo. I clutched the worn leather of my briefcase, the cool, damp air doing little to soothe the ache that had settled deep in my bones. The island itself was a smudge of green and brown against the horizon, a scattering of weathered cottages clinging to the rocky shore. The air here tasted different, cleaner, sharper, laced with the briny tang of kelp and something else. A wildness I couldn't quite place. It was a world away from the city's exhaust fumes and the oppressive weight of memory that clung to my apartment. I'd brought my work with me. Of course, what else did I have? The data, that anomalous flicker in the cosmic microwave background radiation. It was supposed to be a footnote, a statistical anomaly, a glitch in the instruments. But it had gnawed at me, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind, even when I was trying to sleep, even when I was trying to forget. It was too structured, too deliberate. The patterns, when I filtered out the expected noise, were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not random, not natural. The ferry docked with a jarring lurch, the captain, a burly man with a beard as grey as the sea, securing the ropes with practiced efficiency. He nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement of my arrival, a new face on a place that saw few. I disembarked, my boots crunching on the gravel of the small harbour. The islanders, bundled in thick woolens, watched me with a quiet curiosity that felt less intrusive than the pitying glances I'd grown accustomed to back on the mainland. I'd rented a small cottage on the western edge of the island, a place that promised solitude and a clear view of the night sky. The walk from the harbour was longer than I'd anticipated, a winding path that hugged the coastline, the sea a constant, restless presence to my left. The wind whipped my hair around my face, carrying the cries of gulls and the distant bleating of sheep. It was a primal symphony, a soundtrack to my self-imposed exile. The cottage was as advertised, small, stone, and undeniably remote. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of peat smoke and damp earth. A single oil lamp sat on the rough-hewn table, its wick still unlit. I dropped my briefcase and walked to the window. The sea stretched out before me, an endless expanse of shifting greys and blues, meeting the bruised sky at a blurred horizon. Later, the sky bled into twilight, a bruised purple and orange affair. It was the perfect canvas for contemplation. I unlatched my briefcase, the familiar scent of old paper and ink a small comfort. The anomaly. It lay buried in terabytes of information, a faint signal that had been dismissed by my colleagues as sensor error. But I'd seen it. I'd felt it. It was a mathematical signature, elegant and complex, that spoke of an intelligence far beyond our own. Not just intelligent, but ancient, vast, something that had been observing, calculating for eons. The numbers swam before my eyes, but the underlying pattern, the impossible elegance of it, remained. This wasn't just a passive observer. The implications were staggering. The data suggested a subtle manipulation, a guiding hand that had shaped the very fabric of the universe, nudging stars into formation, guiding galaxies in their slow, majestic dance. It was a terrifying thought, this notion of an architect of reality, a force that had orchestrated existence itself. And then the most unsettling part. The anomaly wasn't static. It was evolving. It was focusing. And the direction of that focus, the vector of its attention, was pointed directly towards us, towards Earth. The thought was absurd, a product of too much isolation, too much grief. Yet the numbers didn't lie. They were stark, irrefutable. A cosmic lens, slowly, deliberately zooming in, I stared at the printouts, the lamplight flickering. The wind outside seemed to pick up, moaning around the cottage. The data felt real. The patterns were too precise, too profound to be mere delusion. But the implications, they were a precipice, and I felt myself teetering on the edge. What did this ancient, observing intelligence want with a small, blue planet, so insignificant in the grand cosmic tapestry? The ferry lurched, throwing me against the salt-crusted railing. Below, the water churned, a restless, indifferent grey. It had been weeks since I'd last seen the mainland, weeks since I'd traded the sterile hum of the observatory for the damp, pervasive quiet of this island community. Ferry only runs once a week. My wife, Alina, would have loved it here. The raw, untamed beauty, the isolation. She'd always found solace in the edges of things. I pulled my coat tighter, the wool smelling faintly of mildew and brine. The wind whipped my hair across my face, and I wiped it away, the gesture automatic. My thoughts, however, were less easily dismissed. They circled back relentlessly to the data, to the impassable fluctuations. I tried to rationalize them, to find the mundane explanation, the equipment malfunction, the cosmic ray interference. But the patterns, they were too precise, too deliberate. The island loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. A few scattered lights twinkled, beacons in the encroaching twilight. It was a small place, a handful of houses clinging to the rocky shore, a single, weathered general store, and the lighthouse, its lamp already beginning its slow, rhythmic sweep. My rented cottage was on the far side, a solitary structure overlooking the turbulent sea. The ferry docked with a jarring scrape. The captain, a gruff man with eyes the color of sea-worn glass, securing the ropes with practiced efficiency. He barely grunted a farewell as I disembarked, the damp air clinging to me like a shroud. The walk to the cottage was a familiar trek, my boots crunching on the gravel path. Each step was a small victory against the inertia that had threatened to swallow me whole after Alina's passing. I was here, on this desolate rock, to escape, but escape was proving to be a more complicated endeavor than I'd anticipated. The universe, it seemed, refused to be ignored. Inside the cottage, the air was cold and still. I lit a fire, the flames struggling to catch at first, then roaring to life, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. I made myself a cup of strong, black coffee, the bitter taste a welcome anchor. Then I sat at the small desk, my laptop open, the screen a stark white rectangle in the dim room. The observatory's remote access was still functioning, a lifeline to the data I couldn't shake. I ran the diagnostics again, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Every parameter checked out. The telescopes were calibrated. The sensors were functioning within normal ranges, yet the anomaly persisted. It wasn't a single event, but a series of them, clustered around a specific point in the sky, a region of seemingly empty space. My breath hitched. The pattern was unmistakable. It was the same signature I'd seen weeks ago, the one that had first unsettled me, then terrified me. It wasn't a glitch. It was a signal, or more accurately, a disruption. A ripple. I zoomed in, the digital stars resolving into sharper points of light, and then I saw it. Not a visual phenomenon, not something I could see, in the traditional sense, but a disruption in the very fabric of space-time. A tremor in the cosmic background radiation, too subtle for most instruments, too profound to be natural. It was like a whisper in the static, a breath held in the vacuum. My hands began to shake, the mug rattling against the saucer. This wasn't just anomalous data. This was intentional. The sheer scale of it, the impossible precision, pointed to something beyond any known physical law. It was like finding a perfectly formed snowflake on the surface of the sun. I pulled up the historical logs, scrolling back, my eyes burning. Had I missed it before? Had I dismissed it as noise? There in the archived data from months, even years ago, were faint echoes of the same pattern. Fainter, yes, but present. It was growing, evolving. This wasn't just a curiosity. This was a presence. An ancient, vast intelligence not observing but interacting. And the data pointed to its recent, intense focus on a particular sector of the galaxy. Our sector. My gaze drifted to the window. The sea was a black mirror now, reflecting the few stars that dared to pierce the clouds. But what if the Guardian was no longer enough? I leaned back, the the chair creaking under my weight. The fire crackled, the only sound besides the distant roar of the waves. My mind raced, trying to grasp the implications. If this entity was actively influencing the universe, what did that mean for us, for reality itself? And why now? Why was its attention fixed on this tiny, insignificant planet? I looked back at the screen, at the elegant, terrifying lines of the anomaly. It was a language I was only beginning to decipher, a message from an unfathomable source. And I had a sickening feeling that the message was not one of greeting, but of something far, far worse. Was it a prelude to something, or was the unraveling already underway, too subtle for us to perceive until it was too late? The wind whipped my hair across my face, carrying the sharp tang of brine and something else, something metallic and coppery that made the back of my throat prickle. I gripped the railing tighter, my grip tight against the rough wood. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, felt like a forgotten corner of the world, a place where time itself had slowed to a crawl. It was exactly what I'd sought: isolation. A place to disappear, to drown myself in the cold, hard facts of the cosmos. But the facts, as I'd discovered, no longer cold. They were alive. Back in my rented cottage, the air thick with the smell of damp plaster and old wood smoke, I hunched over the laptop. The data streams, once a comforting cascade of numbers and charts, now felt like a snarling, chaotic beast. I'd been sifting through the observatory's deep space scans, the ones I'd downloaded before leaving, looking for anything. A flicker, a pattern, anything to explain the persistent, gnawing unease that had settled in my gut. Then I'd found it. Not in the familiar constellations, not in the predictable dance of distant galaxies. A patch of sky where the light simply stopped. My fingers trembled as I zoomed in, the pixels resolving into a perfect, inky blackness that seemed to swallow the very concept of light. It was too uniform, too absolute. The universe, in its infinite, chaotic glory, was never truly silent. But this was a deafening absence. I ran the spectral analysis again and again. The results were nonsensical. No known element, no gravitational lensing, no interstellar dust cloud could account for it. It was a hole punched through reality, and the edges of that hole pulsed with an energy I couldn't quantify. An energy that felt watchful. My breath hitched. My gaze drifted to a photograph on the desk, my wife's smile frozen in time. Her absence was a constant ache, a dull throb beneath my ribs. I'd thought the vastness of space would offer solace, a perspective that would shrink my grief to insignificance. It felt intentional. I started cross-referencing the anomaly's coordinates with other datasets, pushing the observatory's archived transmissions to their limits. Days blurred into nights. The rhythmic crash of waves outside became a relentless soundtrack to my obsession. My eyes burned, dry and gritty. My hands were stained with ink from frantic scribbling in a notebook. Then, buried deep within a raw, uncatalogued data log from a probe that had ventured further than any other, I found it. A faint, recurring signal. It wasn't radio waves, not gamma rays, not anything that fit our known spectrum. It was a subtle modulation of spacetime itself, a whisper in the cosmic background radiation. I isolated the signal, amplifying it, struggling to decipher its structure. It wasn't random. There was a complexity to it, a layered intricacy that hinted at intelligence. Not just any intelligence, but something ancient, something vast. I ran it through every translation algorithm I had, every pattern recognition software. Nothing. It was like trying to understand a language spoken by a god. This wasn't just a cosmic curiosity. This was evidence. And the signal, it was too close, too coherent. My gaze snapped back to the anomaly on the screen. The blackness seemed to deepen, to press in on me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to shut the laptop, to flee this small cottage, to run to the dark and board the next ferry, no matter when it would arrive. But the signal, it was still there, a faint, insistent pulse. The screen flickered, then resolved into a mosaic of impossibly fine lines. They weren't stars. They weren't galaxies. They were patterns. Intricate, geometric designs that shifted and reformed, like a cosmic tapestry being woven and unraveled simultaneously. My breath caught in my throat. These patterns, they were familiar. I'd seen them before, not in space, but here. In the ancient, forgotten ruins scattered across this very island, the weathered stones of the standing circles, the faded carvings on the dolmens, they mirrored the designs, the impassable geometries that now pulsed on my screen. How? How could terrestrial ruins, built by primitive hands, reflect something so utterly alien, so impassably distant? It was a connection, and the patterns weren't just geometric. They were a language, a blueprint. My eyes darted to the window, to the inky blackness of the night sky beyond. There was I being watched. The signal continued its faint, rhythmic pulse, a siren song from the edge of existence. There was this intelligence merely observing, or was it already reaching out, its influence seeping into the very foundations of my reality? The salt spray stung my cheeks, a cold, insistent reminder of my isolation. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, was a collection of weathered shacks clinging to a rocky outcrop. My rented room, a cramped space smelling perpetually of damp wool and old fish, offered little solace. I'd come here seeking silence, a place where the ceaseless hum of the city and the louder echoes of my grief might finally recede. Instead, I found a different kind of noise, started with the static. Not the gentle hiss of radio waves, but a sharp, percussive crackle that seemed to emanate from the very air. It would surge when I was reviewing the data, a sudden intrusion into the sterile quiet of my makeshift study. At first, I dismissed it as atmospheric interference, the island's remote location playing havoc with my equipment. But the pattern was too specific, too tied to the moments I felt I was on the cusp of a breakthrough. My wife, Elena, had loved this island. She'd found beauty in its starkness, in the relentless, unyielding sea. I remembered her laughter, bright and clear, cutting through the wind as we walked the narrow paths. I clutched a faded photograph of her, her eyes smiling out from the glossy surface, a phantom touch on my cheek. The anomaly I'd discovered wasn't just a blip. It was a symphony of impassably ordered signals, a deliberate pattern woven into the fabric of space-time. It spoke of an intelligence so vast, so ancient, that our understanding of the universe was like a child's drawing of a supernova. One evening, the static intensified. I felt a prickling sensation crawl up my spine, the hairs on my arms standing on end. My breath hitched. I looked at my monitor, the swirling patterns of the anomaly now seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. Then it happened. A new string of data appeared, overlaid on the existing anomaly. It was incredibly faint, like a ghost in the machine, but it was there. I zoomed in, my fingers trembling. The spectral lines resolved into something that made my stomach churn. It was a signature, a pattern, a message. It wasn't in any language I knew, of course. But the structure, the mathematical elegance, was irrefutable. It was similar, eerily so, to the patterns found in ancient terrestrial artifacts, in megalithic structures that defied conventional explanation. The same underlying architecture, distorted by time and distance, but undeniably present. This wasn't the first time. My mind reeled. This entity, this cosmic consciousness, had been here before, not just observing, but interacting. It had left its mark on our own planet, millennia ago, in ways we had never understood. I thought of the hushed tones of archaeologists, the frustrated scholars poring over undecipherable runes. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee, to pack my bags and catch the next ferry, to disappear back into the anonymity of the mainland. But my gaze was drawn back to the screen, to the spectral signature that pulsed with an alien rhythm. It was a confirmation, a terrifying validation. The universe was not empty. It was crowded with intelligences, and one of them had noticed me, or worse, had noticed us. The air grew thick, suffocating. I could feel a pressure building behind my eyes, a dull throbbing that mirrored the erratic pulse on my screen. This was not a random cosmic event. This was a deliberate act. I reached for my coffee, my hand shaking so violently that I spilled the lukewarm liquid onto my desk. Elena had always told me to be careful, to slow down. The signature on the screen pulsed, a beacon of ancient, alien intent. It was no longer just data. It was a declaration. There was this why Elena had been so drawn to this place. Had she felt it too? The air on the island community, ferry only runs once a week, tasted of brine and something else, something metallic and sharp. It clung to the back of my throat, a persistent reminder of the data I'd brought with me, a digital ghost whispering secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. My rented room was a box of shadows, the single lamp casting weak circles on the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the sea gnawed at the rocks with a rhythmic, unsettling hiss. I'd spent the last 3 days hunched over my laptop, the glow of the screen a meager sun in the perpetual twilight of this place. The anomaly. It wasn't just a blip, a statistical outlier. It was a pattern, a deliberate, intricate weave in the fabric of cosmic background radiation. My wife, Clara, had loved stargazing. She'd pointed out constellations, spun tales of gods and heroes in the dust motes of the Milky Way. Now, all I saw were fingerprints. The data streamed in, raw and unfiltered, from the remote observatory I'd managed to access. It was a trickle at first, then a torrent. The anomaly wasn't static. It pulsed. It shifted. It responded. I'd fed it parameters, hypothetical scenarios based on theoretical wave functions, and each time the anomaly flexed, bending the cosmic noise to its will. It was like trying to grasp smoke, only the smoke was made of starlight, and the hand that held it was impossibly ancient. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, felt more isolated than ever. The few locals I'd seen a taciturn fisherman mending nets, a woman with eyes like chipped sea glass, tending a small, wind-battered garden, moved with a slowness that bordered on torpor. They were like creatures accustomed to the slow decay of time, oblivious to the cosmic forces I was beginning to perceive. I zoomed in on a specific frequency band, a region I'd initially dismissed as interference. But it wasn't interference. It was a signal, faint but distinct, layered beneath the static. It was a key, I realized, a Rosetta Stone for the anomaly. Nothing. The universe, as far as our instruments and theories could tell us, had been silent in this regard until now. Until me. The metallic tang in the air intensified, a coppery scent that made my stomach clench. I rerouted the data feed, pushing the observatory's sensors to their absolute limit. I needed more. I needed to see the shape of this thing. Then I saw it. A convergence. The anomaly wasn't just there, it was moving. Its influence, a subtle warp in space-time, was coalescing around a specific point, a point that was rapidly approaching. I pulled up astronomical charts, my heart beginning to thud a heavy, uneven rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't a random drift. This was a deliberate trajectory, the point of convergence. It was a known celestial event, a rare planetary alignment, one that occurred only once every few millennia. It was supposed to be a spectacle of gravitational harmony, a cosmic ballet. But the data I was seeing painted a far more sinister picture. The anomaly was not merely observing this alignment, it was using it. It was amplifying it, twisting its gravitational forces, turning a natural phenomenon into a focal point. A bead of sweat trickled down my temple. When the light returned, the numbers on the screen seemed to swim, the elegant curves of the data now jagged, menacing. The anomaly was preparing. It was gathering its strength, focusing its immense, unfathomable will towards a singular moment in time. And that moment was terrifyingly close. My breath hitched. The sea outside seemed to roar, a hungry, guttural sound. Clara's face flashed in my mind, her laughter like wind chimes. He had always found beauty in the vastness of space. What would she think of this? This vast, ancient intelligence that treated the cosmos as its personal playground, its grand experiment. The alignment was scheduled for the next lunar cycle, less than a month. The anomaly's influence was already measurable, a subtle distortion that would grow exponentially as the celestial bodies drew closer. It was like watching a spider meticulously spin its web, each strand a ripple in reality, all leading to a single, inevitable trap. My hand trembled as I reached for a glass of water on the bedside table. The water sloshed, spilling onto the worn wood. The metallic scent was stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was the smell of old blood, I realized with a sickening lurch, but on a scale that dwarfed any earthly horror. I stared at the screen, the intricate, terrifying dance of cosmic forces laid bare. The anomaly wasn't a passive observer. It was an architect, a sculptor, and it was about to reshape the universe in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And Earth, my home, my fragile, insignificant planet, was directly in its path. The metallic tang in the air of the island community, ferry only runs once a week, was more than just the sea's harsh perfume. It was the scent of my own fear, a sharp, coppery note that prickled my nostrils. I'd spent the night wrestling with the implications of the latest readings, my mind a battlefield of logic and a growing, nameless dread. The screen glowed with spectral lines, elegant mathematical proofs of an impassable presence. It wasn't just a signal, it was a signature, an artist's stroke across the canvas of creation, so vast, so ancient, that my own existence felt like a flicker in its gaze. I needed to speak to someone, anyone. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, was small, insular. People knew each other or thought they did. Perhaps one of them would listen. I packed my laptop, the weight of it a familiar, comforting burden. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, was waking up. The salty air carried the distant clang of a bell, the murmur of voices. I found the local constable near the small, weathered docks. He was a broad-shouldered man, his face etched with the sun and the relentless wind. His uniform was faded, his demeanor calm, almost languid. I approached him, my voice feeling too loud, too urgent in the quiet morning. "Excuse me," I began, my throat tight. "I'm Thomas. I need to report something unusual." He turned, his gaze steady, unhurried. "Unusual, I say. We get our share of unusual on the island community. Ferry only runs once a week. Lost tourists, rogue seals, that sort of thing." A faint smile played on his lips. "No, this is different," I insisted, fumbling with my laptop. "It's about the stars. I'm an astrophysicist. I've been tracking a signal, a pattern, and it's not natural. It's intelligence, and it's looking at us." I opened the laptop, the screen a stark white in the morning light. I tried to explain, to show him the graphs, the anomalies, the sheer statistical impossibility of it all. I spoke of the subtle shifts, the gravitational whispers that shouldn't be there, the geometric impossibilities in the cosmic background radiation. His expression remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the screen but not seeing the data. He saw a man, agitated, talking about things he couldn't possibly grasp. "Intelligence," he repeated, his voice flat. "From the stars. I've been out here too long, Mr. Thomas. The air, it plays tricks." He gestured vaguely to the sea. "We get a lot of city folk come here to get away. Sometimes they get a bit lost." "I'm not lost," I said, my voice rising. "This is real. This entity, it's influencing things. The metallic taste was back, stronger now." He closed the laptop gently, his large hand covering the keyboard. "Mr. Thomas, this island community, ferry only runs once a week, is a peaceful place. We don't have threats like that. We have bad weather, sure. We have the occasional dispute over fishing rights, but no cosmic intelligences." He looked at me, his eyes not unkind, but filled with a deep, weary skepticism. "Perhaps I should sit down, have a cup of tea. The local cafe opens soon." His dismissiveness was a physical blow. I felt a wave of nausea. I'd expected disbelief, perhaps, but not this utter, placid certainty that I was simply mistaken, deluded. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone with a truth that was too vast for the confines of this small, isolated world. I walked away from the constable, the laptop now feeling like a lead weight in my bag. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, seemed to shrink around me. The colorful fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, the quaint cottages, the very air, it all felt like a fragile illusion, a stage set about to be torn down. The metallic scent intensified, acrid now, like ozone before a storm. I sought out the island's historian, an elderly woman who ran the small, dusty museum. He was known for her sharp mind, her encyclopedic knowledge of the island community. Ferry only runs once a week, and its strange folklore. Maybe she, with her understanding of the past, would see the echoes of what I was describing. I showed her the data, the charts, the impossible correlations. She listened intently, her eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, darting between my face and the glowing screen. She asked me questions, sharp and precise, about the origins of the signal, its frequency, its modulation. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Then she leaned back, a sigh escaping her lips. "Fascinating, mister, truly fascinating. It reminds me of the old tales, the Sky Weaver. Our ancestors spoke of such things." They knew, I pressed, my voice hoarse. They saw it. She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. They saw what they could, mister. They interpreted the signs through their own understanding. The stars have always been a mystery. They've inspired wonder and fear for millennia. My data, it's a modern interpretation of an ancient fear. She tapped a gnarled finger on the glass display case, which held a collection of weathered sea glass. We are all looking for meaning, aren't we? For something greater than ourselves. Sometimes we find it in the patterns of the cosmos. Other times, she paused, her gaze drifting towards the window, where the vast, indifferent ocean stretched to the horizon. We find it in the stories we tell ourselves. Her words were a gentle, silken cage. She wasn't dismissing me, not outright. He was reframing me, placing me within the context of myth and legend, a man lost in his own anxieties, projecting them onto the indifferent stars. The metallic tang was almost unbearable now, a physical manifestation of my isolation. I was a prophet without a flock, a messenger with a message no one could or would receive. The island community, ferry only runs once a week, felt like a trap, and the vast, silent intelligence I detected, the one that was now undoubtedly aware of my struggle, was it amused by my futile attempts to warn them? Or was it simply observing, as it always had, the slow, inevitable unraveling? The ferry groaned, a symphony of tortured metal and weary engines, as it nudged against the barnacle-encrusted pilings. The salt spray, thick and biting, coated my face, a welcome sting against the lingering metallic taste in my mouth. He was still here, the analyst, her gaze a cool, unwavering blue as she watched me disembark onto the damp, creaking planks of the dock. This island community, ferry only runs once a week, felt like the edge of the world, a place where the usual rules of noise and speed frayed into a quiet, insistent hum. I clutched the worn leather satchel containing the data, my grip tight. Each step onto the island felt heavier than the last. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying the scent of brine, decaying kelp, and something else, something sharp and alien. It pricked at the back of my throat, a phantom sensation that mirrored the data I'd spent weeks sifting through. The anomalies weren't just numbers on a screen anymore. They were a presence. The analyst followed, him footsteps silent on the wet wood. "Thomas," he began, his voice low, cutting through the mournful cry of a distant gull. "The preliminary readings from the observatory confirm your findings. The spectral shifts are unprecedented." Unprecedented. A sterile word for something that felt like the universe itself was exhaling a breath it had held for eons. I nodded, unable to speak. The data spoke of patterns, of impassably vast structures weaving through the void, not just existing, but acting. And the patterns were converging, on us. We walked inland, away from the meager cluster of weathered cottages. The wind whipped at my coat, carrying the low rumble of the ocean. It wasn't the sound of waves breaking. It was deeper, a subterranean tremor that vibrated in my bones. The sky overhead was a bruised twilight purple, even though it was barely past noon. The clouds, usually scudding gray masses, hung unnaturally still like painted backdrops. "They're calling it the Great Alignment," the analyst said, her voice tight. "A convergence of several astronomical events, but the energy signatures, they don't match any known celestial phenomena." I stopped, my breath catching. The energy signatures, that was it. The subtle distortions, the impossible energy readings that had driven me to this remote outpost. It wasn't just light bending. It was reality itself being reshaped. "It's not an alignment," I finally managed, my voice raspy. "It's a focus, a lens." He looked at me, him brow furrowed. "A lens for what, Thomas?" I opened the satchel, my fingers fumbling with the clasp. The holographic projector, a bulky, jury-rigged device, whirred to life. I activated the core sequence, the data coalescing into a three-dimensional representation of the night sky. But it was warped, distorted. Lines of impossible geometry, shimmering with an internal, phosphorescent light, crisscrossed the familiar constellations. At the center, a vast, obsidian void pulsed, drawing in the surrounding starlight, not consuming it, but something is, reaching through. The analyst stepped closer, her usual composure fraying. Her hand, usually steady, trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the holographic projection. "But why?" The ground beneath my feet vibrated with a deep, resonant thrum. "We've been noticed." A sudden, blinding flash erupted from the horizon, painting the sky in hues of emerald and violet that seared my retinas. The air grew heavy, viscous, like trying to breathe through honey. The metallic tang returned, stronger now, acrid and suffocating. The analyst stumbled back, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The projector whined, its internal mechanisms straining under an unseen pressure. The stars themselves seemed to be warping, their familiar pinpricks of light elongating, twisting into impassable shapes. This was it, the point of no return. The entity was not just observing, it was arriving. "We have to do something," I said, my voice a desperate plea. "There has to be a way to disrupt it." But as I spoke, a wave of pure, unadulterated wrongness washed over me, a sense of cosmic insignificance so profound it threatened to shatter my very being. The data, the projector, even the analyst, all felt like fleeting illusions against the encroaching, impassable reality. The ground lurched. What had I unleashed by looking? And how could one man possibly stand against the unraveling of everything? The analyst's hand trembled as she reached for the projector's off switch. It was a futile gesture. The whining had stopped, replaced by a silence that pressed against my eardrums, thick and suffocating. The warped stars on the screen remained, their impassable geometries burned into my vision. The room felt wrong. The air, usually cool and sterile, carried a faint metallic tang, like old pennies left in the rain. I looked at my hands. They were the same hands that had traced equations that had held my wife's, but now they felt alien. My skin seemed too thin, the veins beneath a network of impassably blue rivers. I flexed my fingers. The movement was fluid, too fluid, as if the bones inside were no longer solid but some yielding, cartilaginous substance. A phantom chill traced a path down my spine. She hadn't moved from her chair, her eyes fixed on the dead projector screen. Her face, usually a mask of professional detachment, was now a landscape of raw fear. I couldn't answer. The words felt trapped in my throat, like pebbles, the data. It hadn't just been data, it had been a window, and something had looked back, something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent. And it had nudged, a subtle shift, a cosmic sigh that had rippled through the fabric of what I understood as reality. The sky outside was a bruised, twilight purple, the kind of color that precedes a storm. But there was no storm, just an unnerving stillness. The usual city hummed the distant traffic. The faint siren song of urban life was absent. It was as if the world had collectively held its breath. I pushed myself up from my chair. My legs felt unsteady, like a newborn fawn's. The room, once a sanctuary of logic and scientific inquiry, now felt like a tomb. The equipment, the blinking lights, the humming servers, they all seemed to be holding their breath too, waiting. "We need to leave," I finally managed, the words raspy. The analyst finally blinked, her eyes unfocusing from the screen. She looked at me, a flicker of something akin to recognition in her gaze. "Leave? Where would we go?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Where could we go? My mind, usually so sharp, felt like a dulled blade. The familiar landmarks of my life, my research, my apartment, my memories of my wife, they seemed to be receding, becoming hazy and indistinct. The grief for her, once a gaping wound, now felt like a dull ache, a constant thrum beneath the surface of this new, unsettling reality. Each click of my shoes on the linoleum echoed, a stark counterpoint to the profound quiet. I noticed the light fixtures. They seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm, as if struggling to maintain their connection to some unseen power source. We reached the main atrium of the research facility. It was deserted. The usual bustle of late-night researchers, the hushed conversations, the clatter of keyboards all gone. The vast space felt cavernous, empty. A profound sense of isolation washed over me. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was an absence of normalcy. I felt a growing unease, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, but where? The data had shown me the truth, or at least a sliver of it, and the truth was terrifyingly large. It was everywhere. I remembered the analyst's trembling hand, but beneath the fear, something else was stirring within me, a stubborn refusal to surrender. My wife had been taken from me by something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. Now something else was threatening to erase everything. I wouldn't let it. I looked out the massive glass doors of the atrium. The city skyline was a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky, but the lights were wrong. They pulsed with a faint, erratic beat like dying embers. And some of the buildings, the familiar shapes I'd known for years, seemed to be shifting. Subtle changes, imperceptible at first glance, but undeniably present. A spire that was now slightly curved, a facade that seemed to ripple like water. The analyst stood beside me, her breath catching in her throat. "Thomas, look." I followed his gaze. A flock of birds, usually a common sight even at this hour, was taking flight from a nearby building. But they weren't flying in formation. They were erratic, chaotic, their wings beating with a frantic, desperate energy. Metallic scent in the air intensified, sharp and acrid. It prickled at the back of my throat. I felt a tremor run through the floor beneath my feet, not the rumble of an earthquake, but a low, resonant hum, as if the very foundations of the world were vibrating in sympathy with something far beyond. I turned to the analyst, my voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of the city. Now." She nodded, her eyes wide and uncompressor. "But the ferry, it only runs once a week. To the island community, ferry only runs once a week. We'll never make it." The words landed like a blow. The island community, ferry only runs once a week. A sanctuary, or at least it had been. Now, the thought of reaching it felt like a cruel joke. Would the island be spared? Or had the change already reached its shores, twisting its familiar landscape into something unrecognizable? A distant sound reached us then, a low, keening wail that seemed to emanate from the very air around us. It wasn't the sound of wind, nor of any animal I knew. It was a sound that spoke of immense, unimaginable distances, of pressures that could crush stars. It was the sound of something vast and ancient stirring in its slumber, and it was growing louder. I grabbed the analyst's arm, my grip tight. "We have to try." As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the city. One of the skyscrapers, a familiar landmark, seemed to be leaning. Not falling, but subtly, impassably leaning. As if the very ground beneath it had decided to shift its angle. The stars on the projector screen flashed in my mind, their impassable geometries. Had they been a warning, or a glimpse of what was to come? The wail grew, a mournful lament that clawed at my sanity. The metallic tang in the air was now overwhelming, burning my nostrils. I could feel the vibrations in my bones, a deep, resonant thrum that spoke of a universe unraveling. What was happening to the world? And more importantly, was there anywhere left to run? The ferry groaned, a skeletal sound against the gnashing of the waves. Each lurch of the deck sent a fresh wave of nausea through me, a physical manifestation of the unease that had become my constant companion. The salt spray, sharp and cold, stung my cheeks, but it was the chill that seeped into my bones, a deeper, more fundamental cold that truly unsettled me. This island community, ferry only runs once a week, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place to escape the city's impassable leaning, the flickering stars that had burned themselves into my vision. But sanctuary felt like a cruel joke now. I watched the mainland recede, a smudge of grey against a bruised sky. The familiar skyline, the one where the skyscraper had bowed, was swallowed by the haze. It was gone, or rather, it had changed. The data had shown it, the subtle warping of spacetime, the impassable geometry. I had dismissed it as an artifact, a glitch in the cosmic machinery. Now I knew better. The machinery wasn't glitching, it was recalibrating. The ferryman, a weathered man with eyes like chipped sea glass, said nothing. He just steered his vessel through the choppy water, his focus unwavering. I envied his simplicity. His world was the sea, the sky, the predictable rhythm of tides. Mine had fractured, revealing the yawning abyss beneath. As we approached the island, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else, something ancient and earthy. The trees, twisted and gnarled, clawed at the sky, their branches like skeletal fingers. The houses, clustered together like barnacles on a rock, seemed to huddle against an unseen force. There was a stillness here, a preternatural quiet that spoke not of peace, but of held breath. I disembarked onto the small, creaking dock, my boots sinking slightly into the damp, splintered wood. The ferryman gave me a curt nod, his gaze lingering on my face for a moment too long. He saw it, I knew. the mark of the observer. My rented cottage was a small stone structure at the edge of the village, overlooking a desolate stretch of beach. Inside, the air was musty, smelling of old wood and forgotten lives. I laid out the printouts, the charts, the spectral analyses. They seemed almost quaint now, crude approximations of a reality that defied all logic. The stars on the projector screen, the ones that had pulsed with an alien rhythm, were the key. They weren't just stars. They were nodes, points of influence. And Earth, it seemed, had become a focal point. I remembered the conversation with the colleague, his hushed tones, his frantic gestures. He had seen it too, the subtle shifts, the anomalies in the background radiation. He had called it a cosmic restructuring. I had called him mad. Now I wished he were here. We could face this thing, together. But he was likely lost in the new geometry, another piece of the old world rendered obsolete. The wind howled outside, a mournful lament. The sea was a churning grey mass, waves crashing against the shore with relentless force. But it wasn't the sea that held my attention. It was the sky. The stars were out, a breathtaking, terrifying tapestry, but they were different. Brighter, sharper, and their arrangement, it was wrong, utterly, impossibly wrong. They formed patterns, intricate and vast, that spoke of intention, not the random dance of celestial bodies, but a deliberate cosmic choreography. I saw the lines, the connections, the ethereal threads that bound them together. The projector screen had been a pale imitation. This was the real thing, the true face of the universe. A low hum began to fill the air, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island. It resonated in my teeth, in my bones, in the marrow of my being. The cottage walls seemed to shimmer, the stone blurring at the edges. I felt a profound sense of displacement, as if my own atoms were being rearranged. My hands trembled as I reached for the printouts, for the familiar symbols of my former life. But they felt alien, meaningless. What was astrophysics when the laws of physics themselves were being rewritten? What was human comprehension when faced with an intelligence that operated on scales so vast, so ancient, that our entire existence was but a flicker? My face was gaunt, my eyes wide with a terrible understanding. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant. A single, insignificant mote caught in the gears of a cosmic mechanism. The entity, the vast, ancient intelligence, was not coming. It was already here. And it was not merely influencing the universe. It was the universe. The hum intensified, a symphony of impossible frequencies. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a sensation of being seen. Not by eyes, but by something far more pervasive, something that encompassed the totality of existence. The leaning skyscraper, the warped spacetime, the alien constellations, they were all manifestations of its will. And now, its attention was on me. On this tiny island, on this fragile human form, it wasn't malice. It was simply existence. The way a wave exists to crash upon the shore or a star exists to burn. And I, Thomas, was now a part of that existence. A new pattern being woven into the cosmic tapestry. The wind died down. The stars remained, their alien brilliance a testament to the new order. I stood by the window, no longer Thomas the astrophysicist, but something else. Something that understood the fundamental truth of our place. We were not the center of the universe. We were merely a fleeting thought, a momentary ripple in an ocean of unfathomable consciousness. I closed my eyes, not in surrender, but in acceptance. The old world was gone. The new one had arrived. What would become of me now?